What if your fate was sealed before your first breath, long before your eyes opened, long before you had a voice? Your story had already been written? Not by gods, not by destiny, but by ancestors obsessed with legacy who believed that keeping their bloodline pure was the only path to power. For centuries, kings and queens across the globe made a chilling trade political stability in exchange for genetic risk. Cousins married cousins, siblings became spouses, families folded in on themselves like twisted branches of a dying tree. The result, not just royal empires, but broken minds, fragile bodies, and haunted lives. This is not just a story of crowns and castles. It's a story of women. Women born into the gilded cages of their dynasties. Women used as pawns, symbols, sacrifices. Some ruled nations. Others barely survived childhood. All of them were shaped, sometimes destroyed, by the invisible weight of their blood. In this journey, you'll step into their lives, one by one. You'll see what they saw. You'll feel what they carried. And by the end, you won't just remember their names. You'll understand the cost of keeping power in the family. This is Inbred Royalty, the hidden tragedies of history's most isolated bloodlines. And it starts with you. What if your entire existence, your fate, your health, even your mind was decided long before you ever took your first breath, not by choice, not by chance, but by a tradition, an obsession really of keeping bloodlines pure? For centuries, royal families across the world made an unspoken trade political power for genetic risk. They married cousins, uncles, even siblings, believing this would protect their thrones. But behind the gold and glory was a legacy of mental illness, physical deformity, and lives that ended far too soon. Today, you're about to uncover 10 stories. Stories that don't just reveal the hidden horrors of royal bloodlines, they show what happens when the cost of legacy is measured in flesh and bone. Starting at number 10 is Isabella II of Spain. You might imagine a queen ruling with confidence and grace. But Isabella's story begins in shadows. Born in 1830, Isabella was the product of a union between an uncle and his niece, a genetic shortcut repeated so many times in her family tree. Her grandparents on one side were also her great-grandparents on the other. A maze of lineage where every branch curved back inward. When Isabella was just 16, she was married off not to a stranger, but to her double-second cousin. Royal, yes. Healthy, not quite. She would go on to have 11 children, but only 5 would survive past infancy. And here's where things turn murky. Historians believe her husband may not have fathered any of them. Their marriage was more arrangement than affection, more rumor than reality. The whispers about her husband's identity, his preferences, and the couple's cold distance, those whispers never went away. Eventually, Isabella lost her crown. But what lingered was not her political legacy, it was the heavy genetic price her family had paid over generations. A story of a queen, born into power, imprisoned by blood. At number 9, you meet Marie Louise of Austria, whose very DNA reads like a cautionary tale. Her parents, double first cousins. That's not a typo. They shared both sets of grandparents, meaning Marie Louise had only 4 unique great-grandparents. Half the number most people have. She was born into a dynasty where cousin marriages weren't rare, they were expected, even celebrated. But nature doesn't follow court protocol. Out of 12 siblings, only 7 survived. And then came Napoleon. At 18, Marie Louise was offered like a treaty to the Emperor of France, her father's old enemy, a political move wrapped in silk and ceremony but underneath a sacrifice. One girl for peace. One womb to carry an empire's future. The weight of generations now placed on her. From grand palaces to the gravel roads of Appalachia, number 8 shifts the lens to a modern story. Lorraine Whitaker. This isn't ancient history, this is now. You may have seen the documentary. The Whitaker family of West Virginia became the face of something many thought was long gone, extreme inbreeding in the modern world. Lorraine stood at the heart of it, not just as a member of the family, but as the mother of Timmy Whitaker, often described as the most genetically affected individual alive today. This story isn't about judgment, it's about reality. Generations of isolation, secrecy, and lack of education created a situation where biology itself turned hostile. And what's most haunting is this: you don't need a crown or castle for this legacy. It can unfold in silence behind closed doors, far from history books. Coming in at number 7 is Maria I of Portugal, known to some as Maria the Pious, but perhaps more accurately, Maria the Haunted. Born in 1734, Maria was a product of a family tangled beyond comprehension. Her parents, another case of cousin marriage, and the 16th royal Iberian couple joined through blood. But Maria didn't just inherit titles, she inherited duty. And that duty, marrying her own uncle. The result, 6 children. Only 3 survived past childhood. The cost, likely paid in chromosomes and silent suffering. As she aged, Maria's mental state fractured. Her grief became madness, and by the end, she was declared unfit to rule. Not because of a coup, not because of war, but because her family's obsession with lineage finally turned inward and devoured her mind from within. At number 6, you're introduced to Marie-Louise Elizabeth d'Orléans, a name that sounds elegant, noble. But her story is Gothic tragedy soaked in sorrow. Her father was forced to marry his cousin, an illegitimate daughter of King Louis XIV. She in turn was married off to another cousin. The result, 3 children. None survived. By age 14, Marie-Louise turned to alcohol. Desperation, escape, perhaps both. What's clear is that she didn't get a childhood. She got a contract. And the weight of royal obligation crushed her before she ever had a chance to live freely. This isn't just about faulty genetics. It's about trauma passed like heirlooms, expectations too heavy for a girl to carry, and a dynasty that demanded obedience, even as it crumbled from the inside out. And now, halfway down the list, you arrive at number 5, Princess Alexia of Greece, a name that sounds modern, and it is. Born in 1965. Alexia comes from a world that should have known better. Her parents, Queen Anne-Marie of Denmark and King Constantine II of Greece, were second and third cousins. Their marriage wasn't just symbolic, it was woven through a dense web of family connections that echoed centuries of aristocratic planning. King Constantine's great-grandparents were siblings. One of his grandmothers was the sister of his great-grandfather. Even Anne-Marie carried the same old DNA patterns in her blood. To the public, they looked like a fairy tale. But behind the charm and grace were family trees folded in on themselves, roots so twisted they no longer reached the soil. Princess Alexia, like many born into royalty, never asked for this legacy. But she inherited it just the same. A reminder that even in the 20th century, the shadows of bloodline purity hadn't disappeared. At number 4, you come face to face with a ghost from the forgotten pages of the Habsburg dynasty. Maria Antonia of Austria, a name barely remembered, but a genetic legacy impossible to ignore. You've probably heard of Charles II of Spain, the infamous Habsburg monarch whose physical and mental decline became a textbook case of royal inbreeding. But Maria Antonia, she takes that tragedy a step further. Born into the same suffocating family line, Maria Antonia's ancestry wasn't a tree, it was a loop, a circle of repeated names, repeated unions, repeated mistakes. Her bloodline had folded in on itself so many times that scientists later calculated her DNA resembled that of a child born to full siblings. That's not just rare. That's almost unheard of outside the most genetically isolated populations in the world. And yet, unlike Charles II, Maria Antonia was never crowned. She was never mourned by a nation. Her life faded into the background of European history, quiet, unnoticed. But her story is vital because it reminds you that the most extreme consequences of power often fall on those with no voice. At number 3, the story takes you further back than Europe, back to the sands of ancient Egypt. Meet mummies, 317A and 317B, two infant girls whose names have been lost to time, but whose short tragic lives are still speaking today. They were the daughters of Pharaoh Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun, his queen. But Ankhesenamun was more than just Tutankhamun's wife, she was also his half-sister. Their father was Pharaoh Akhenaten, a ruler so obsessed with legacy and divine blood that he shattered traditional boundaries to keep his line pure. Tutankhamun himself was already born of an incestuous union. He suffered from a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and likely chronic pain. By the time he and Ankhesenamun conceived children, the genetic risks had reached a critical mass. The two infant daughters were likely stillborn. Their tiny mummified bodies showed clear signs of developmental disorders, twisted limbs, fragile skulls, incomplete spines. You stand there in front of the glass, staring down at these girls who never had a chance. It's haunting. Not because of curses or myths, but because of math, because even gods cannot cheat biology. At number 2, you come crashing back to the present with a story that feels like fiction, but it's not. Her name is Kimberly, and her family's real surname remains hidden behind a pseudonym. They were known to the world as the Colt family, a name the media used to protect identities while reporting one of the most disturbing modern cases of multi-generational inbreeding. You're not in a palace. You're in rural Australia, remote, isolated, forgotten. Here, the family had lived in secrecy generation after generation, creating their own closed-loop society. Siblings married siblings. Children were born into a nightmare they couldn't escape. Abuse, neglect, and genetic disorders compounded like interest. Kimberly was born into this, a girl who never had a choice. When authorities finally intervened in the early 2000s, they found a web of dysfunction so dense it took years to unravel. Multiple police investigations, children with no clear parentage, genetic conditions so severe that some couldn't speak or care for themselves. Kimberly's DNA told a story no child should ever carry. Not royalty, not chosen, just another victim of isolation turned inward. And then finally you arrive at number 1, the culmination of power and inbreeding, the face of obsession, Cleopatra II Philopator. Forget Hollywood's Cleopatra. This isn't the seductive queen played by silver screen icons. This is an earlier, far more chilling embodiment of the Ptolemaic dynasty's deepest, darkest tradition. Cleopatra the Satyr ruled Egypt during the 2nd century BCE, and her family followed a strict, nearly fanatical policy: marry only within the bloodline. Brother to sister, uncle to niece, cousins as far as the eye could see. This wasn't just preference, it was strategy. A way to keep power tightly gripped, never diluted. Cleopatra's parents, siblings. Her grandparents, siblings. Her own siblings married each other. It wasn't just a family. It was a dynasty of mirrors, each generation reflecting and repeating the same union over and over again. And she didn't stop the cycle. She married her own brother, then another. She gave birth to heirs born into this tangled web, children already burdened before they ever walked. From a genetic standpoint, Cleopatra II was a living concentration of centuries of calculated interbreeding. Her blood wasn't just royal, it was trapped. Yet somehow, she ruled with immense power. She held her throne through uprisings, betrayals, and even war against her own family. But even then, behind her political achievements, you see the cost, the desperation, the unnatural strain of trying to preserve purity in a world where nothing pure ever lasts. And when you look back across queens, empresses, princesses, and peasants alike, you realize something chilling. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even always about tradition. It was about control, legacy, fear of outsiders. A need to believe that power must flow through the same narrow veins again and again, no matter the cost. They were brilliant, tragic, broken, and unforgettable. Their stories weren't just shaped by politics or war, but by gene secrets and the invisible chains of blood. Step back for a moment and take a breath. Because what you've just seen, what you've just felt, are stories etched into history not by battles or treaties, but by chromosomes. And we're not done yet. There's one more thread to pull, one more twisted tale to unravel. One that may not come with titles or crowns, but still carries the full brutal legacy of obsession with purity. Because this isn't just ancient history. This is a pattern, a warning whispered across centuries. And it begins again in forgotten corners with women like you whose lives are written not in freedom, but in inheritance. It's easy to imagine inbreeding as something distant, locked in dusty tomes buried under marble statues and grand palaces. But the truth, it exists where isolation thrives, and where power, whether political, familial, or emotional, goes unchecked. These women, whether queens or unknown daughters, were shaped by choices they never made. They were handed destinies already cracked and splintering. Some survived, some ruled, some collapsed under the weight of expectation and biology alike, but all of them paid the price. You remember Isabella II of Spain, forced into a marriage with a cousin. Her husband possibly never touched her. Her children? Possibly not his. Her crown slipped away, but her name remains a footnote in the story of royal fragility. You recall Marie Louise of Austria, a young girl handed to Napoleon like a pawn on a board. Her genes already compressed her world built on political calculations that left no space for her own. And then there's Maria Threi of Portugal, a woman so consumed by grief and mental deterioration that her reign ended not in death, but in a declaration of madness, a mind that buckled under the pressure of too many repeated names in her family tree. Then came Marie Louise Elizabeth, married off as a child deadened by sorrow before she reached adulthood. Her childhood replaced with wine glasses and funeral processions. These weren't coincidences. They weren't rare. You saw the pattern in Princess Alexia of Greece, a modern reminder that the same tight ropes still hung in the air long after the palaces turned to museums. You saw it in Maria Antonia, whose genetic profile reads like a mirror cracked in every direction, and in those two tiny mummies, silent girls, daughters of a divine bloodline that finally broke under its own weight. And Kimberly, the girl from a nameless valley in Australia, showed you that you don't need jewels or thrones for these stories to repeat. All it takes is isolation, secrecy, and the belief that keeping blood pure is more important than letting people live full, free, healthy lives. And finally, Cleopatra II, a woman who reigned over a powerful kingdom while bearing the crushing weight of generations of closed-loop ancestry. Her body may have been royal, but her blood was weary. So what do you take away from all this? Maybe it's this power that clings to itself decays. Purity, when pursued at all costs, poisons everything it touches. The idea that blood must remain within certain lines, that outsiders must stay out, that heritage is more important than health, that kind of thinking. It breaks people. Quietly, relentlessly, and sometimes fatally. These women weren't just victims, they were symbols. Symbols of how easily tradition can become a trap, how easily a crown can become a cage. And if you trace the timelines, you'll notice something eerie. The more closed off the lineage, the shorter it survives. Dynasties collapse, minds falter, bodies give way. The very thing they tried to preserve, legacy, gets swallowed by the very system meant to protect it. What's left are ruins. A genetic echo passed down through centuries. But maybe that echo doesn't have to repeat forever. Today you live in a world where science understands these risks, where diversity isn't feared, it's celebrated, where you can break cycles, not continue them, where bloodlines don't need to be pure, they need to be human. And that's what these women in all their pain and complexity show you. Not just how power can fail, but how even in silence truth endures. Because beneath every royal crest, behind every golden frame, is a woman who bled, who wept, who was shaped by forces she never chose. And now you know her story. Now you remember her name.